We've got a special recipe for you today, folks. For starters, here are the ingredients that you're gonna need. 1 tablespoon salt, 1 small onion, quartered, 1 garlic clove, 1 bay leaf, 6 peppercorns, and the most important ingredient of all, 1 human head with the tongue. Step 1. Cleave the head into quarters. Step 2. Remove the brains, teeth, nose, and eyes, but be sure to retain the ears. Step 3. Cover the head with fresh, cold water, add salt, bring to a boil, and skim. Cover and simmer for 1 hour. And finally, step 4. Add the remaining ingredients and continue cooking until the flesh separates from the bone. After that, bon appetit!
What you've just heard is a recipe from the only cookbook written by an actual cannibal. This recipe, titled Ed Gein's Head Cheese, leaves little to imagination. Much like its creator, convicted murderer and cannibal, Nico Claux.
I tried to cut a head once, but I didn't have the right tools, so I came back later and it was too deteriorated.
What would be fun would be using human people in the same kind of industry. Like imagine having slaughterhouses with people, you would hang them from hooks, use an electric gun on them and...
Are you sure this isn't going to get us banned from YouTube?
The few bits of flesh that I was able to actually cut from the cadavers, I tried to, fry them and eat them with different kinds of side things, different condiments. I don't know, it acted on me like a drug. There was this feeling of guilt, but also I felt a weird feeling of actually having done something that was against the natural order.
Nico Claux was standing in front of his dead grandfather, and he believed that it was his fault. At just 10 years old, it was this experience that formed Nico's obsession with not just death, but dead bodies. At the time, no one could have known that that obsession would spiral into consuming meat from cadavers, drinking blood meant for hospital patients, or robbing graves in the dead of night. But at that family outing in 1982, something clicked for Nico. He'd convinced his ill grandfather to play badminton with him. During the game, his grandfather suffered from a cerebral embolism and collapsed to the grass, dying in front of young Nico. According to him, his family's reaction was even more traumatizing.
Well, the family more or less blamed me on that because we were playing a badminton game and he just collapsed during the game. So they kind of blamed me on the fact that I insisted on playing the game when he was not feeling well. And they kind of accused me of his death. And we all went to the funeral wake, and this is when it was the first time when I saw an actual dead person, and also the first time when I entered the funeral home, and I was just fascinated by the atmosphere.
Nico did not have a normal childhood by any means. A French citizen born in Cameroon in 1972, he traveled around frequently, which made it challenging to make friends. His father worked for international banks, which meant they were often on contract in a country for only about 2 years before they'd move on. As an only child, Nico felt incredibly isolated.
Moving all the time made it much harder to interactions with other kids and to establish trust and friendships. So yes, it was definitely harder as a kid to have basic interactions with kids my age. So I was very introvert when I was a kid, and I built my own little fantasy world in which I lived.
And that little fantasy world is where Nico has continued to live for the rest of his life. By the time he was a preteen, he was sneaking into graveyards and became mystified by what he describes as an energy that he felt inside him. With few friends and no siblings, he felt more at home there than anywhere else.
I used to go to graveyards quite a lot. I would teach school and go to graveyards. And I would just walk among the tombs and try to look inside the bigger mausoleums, because they had small windows where you could actually have a look inside the crypt.
After managing to pry open the rusty locks on the mausoleums, Nico gradually progressed to cracking open coffins and crypts to see the bodies inside. The very first cadaver he saw was just bones. A skeleton resting in an eternal slumber with a peeping Tom peering through their casket. When he was eventually arrested by authorities, Nico described his first experience with the skeleton. Allegedly, it was the corpse of a woman who was a Russian immigrant from the early 1900s. He described her as half-rotten, covered in a sheet. Her face was smeared with what he described as death fluids oozing out of her skin. As he lifted the white cloth to stare into her dark, empty eye sockets, he knew what he wanted to do next. He took the very same screwdriver he had used to open the coffin and stabbed it into the corpse of the woman. He claimed to have stabbed her over and over, nearly 50 times, before he snuck out of the cemetery, his arms coated in the slime of the corpse. That experience of desecrating and watching the dead made Nico feel like, in his own words, an emperor reigning in hell. Opening caskets and digging into fresh graves went on to become an obsession of Nico's, a thirst that he needed to quench.
You're doing something that will forever, cast you aside from society. So it was intense, that's all I can say. I also felt this spiritual experience, in a way. I was hyper-focused on what I was doing.
But there were other things that Nico was ruminating on that would forever cast him aside from society. Often, he dreamt about murdering the classmates that teased him.
I would fantasize over stabbing them. And at first, the fantasies, they were very, very primitive because I didn't have any grasp of anatomy. So for me, killing somebody was very easy. You just had to stab him in the neck or, it was easy.
Fortunately, Nico didn't act on those feelings, but that didn't stop him from dipping into his darker desires in increasingly concerning and, not to mention, dangerous ways. By the time he turned 17, he was stealing bones and body parts from cemeteries and smuggling them into his house, where he would hide them from his parents in his basement bedroom. At one point, his father discovered a massive bag of mismatched bones beneath his bed. One could only imagine the horror that he felt holding a bag of human bones that he uncovered stashed beneath his teenage son's bed. When his father confronted him, Nico told him that the bones were given to him by a friend, and thus the issue was quickly swept under the rug, though it wasn't the last time that Nico would be confronted. St. Vincent de Paul Hospital in Paris, one of the oldest children's hospitals in the world, the site of countless births, countless deaths, and also the location of Nico Claux' first job as a morgue attendant. The very first autopsy he performed was on a 10-year-old girl, where he learned how to properly stitch up her torso. The job of a morgue attendant is simple: to respect the bodies, assist with the autopsy, and stitch up the body afterwards so that the deceased can be ready to be reunited with their bereaved loved ones for one final time. But being left alone with a body to stitch it up left Nico free to indulge in the darkest of his desires. According to him, it wasn't until he took a job at St. Joseph Hospital in December of 1993 that he had his very first taste of human flesh. He would cut strips of muscle from inside the chest cavity of the cadavers, reviewing the medical files before cutting to ensure that he was eating a person who was relatively healthy. Often, he would eat the meat raw. He has described it as reminding him of steak tartar. Sometimes he would sneak the pieces of abdominal muscle home and fry them. When he was asked how he felt about taking his first bite of human flesh, he responded that he thought, "Cool, I'm a cannibal now."
Because I only had access to flesh from the abdominal cavities. And of course, I had this craving for other pieces, but it would imply actually mutilating the cadaver, and it would have shown immediately, you know.
Nico's job gave him access to not just dead bodies, but ample amounts of blood.
During the morning, I was working in the morgue, and in the afternoons, I worked in a surgery unit. So one of the tasks that I had to do was to go to the blood bank, get blood bags, and bring them to during the operations. And there was this system with stickers attached to the blood bags. And if some of the blood bags were used during the operation, you had to remove the stickers and bring them back to the blood bank. And of course, when there were bags that were not used, instead of bringing them entirely, I would just bring the sticker and pretend that they had been used, because it was their system of doing it. And I was able to steal several bags a week like that. So I didn't drink everything, of course. It would have made me really sick, I guess.
Once he had the blood bags at home, Nico would drink the blood straight.
Such fine crystal shouldn't go to waste.
On occasion, he would mix it with human ashes or even protein powder to make a shake. He claims that drinking the blood made him feel alive in a way that people who haven't can't comprehend. He described himself as feeling more alive than people who I saw on the subway or even on the streets. For me, everybody looked like ghosts. They had no conscience, and I'd walk among them and feel like I was the only person alive. When he wasn't using the blood for drinking, he would use it in ritual sacrifices. Nico is self-described as a Satanist with a specific interest in Pazuzu, the king of demons. With blood, bones, and human flesh at his disposal, Nico was able to take part in rituals that made him feel what he describes as the energy of the dead. Soon, however, he found himself looking for more. The aforementioned childhood fantasies that Nico had had about murdering his classmates would eventually evolve into daydreams about murdering his co-workers. He planned to murder a total of 3 people. But first, he decided he had to get his feet wet. His girlfriend, at the time, allegedly worked as a dominatrix, using an early form of the internet called the Minitel to reach out to clients.
French have been using the video text for 10 years already. By telephone, they look through an electronic phone book, movie listings, or a database, usually on this type of terminal.
It was here that Nico decided to try his luck. He connected with a homosexual man on a BDSM forum. After chatting for a bit, the man, Thierry Bissonnier, invited Nico to his apartment under the impression that they'd spend the afternoon together. Tragically, this would end up being the last afternoon of Thierry's life. Nico arrived at the apartment concealing a .22 caliber gun in his pocket. When Thierry opened the door to greet the man that he expected to be his lover, he found himself face to face with his killer instead.
And I shot him when he opened the door several times.
Nico riddled Thierry with bullets, an innocent man cut down in his prime and leaving a devastated family behind. But Nico didn't just leave after he shot Thierry. He watched him bleed out on the carpet, then began to meander around, looking around his home as if it was a museum. When he had finished his tour, Nico returned to discover that Thierry was still alive. He was moving and taking gasping breaths, as if he was breathing through a straw. To kill him, Nico lifted a potted plant into the air and smashed it down on Thierry's head, crushing his skull. And before leaving, Nico then cleaned his fingerprints off the potted plant, stole Thierry's wallet, and fled the scene. According to Nico, he didn't feel bad about what he'd done.
No empathy, no. I felt detached, and I was actually observing things. and watching things on the side. But there was actually absolutely no emotion.
3 days would go by before Thierry's body was discovered. After not being able to contact him, his parents finally entered his apartment themselves, only to discover the heartbreaking sight of their dead son. Fortunately, they didn't have to wait long for Nico to be apprehended because he soon made a fatal mistake. At a local store, Nico attempted to use one of Thierry's checks to buy a VCR. To prove that his identity matched the name on the checks, Nico showed the cashier Thierry's license, which he had pasted his own picture onto. The cashier quickly caught on to this scam, prompting Nico to flee the scene. His aforementioned fatal mistake, however, was that he left behind Thierry's ID at the store, which once again had his own picture pasted over it. And this would go on to give police a roadmap to exactly who they were searching for. It was here that Nico Claux realized that he was feeling his last few seconds of freedom, at least for a while. Police officers rushed toward him outside the most famous club in Paris, handcuffs at the ready. He had been recognized from the picture he taped over Thierry's ID.
Immediately I knew that it was over because, I didn't care to get rid of any weapon. So everything was at my place.
It wasn't just the gun that was at Nico's place, but there was much, much more. In fact, there was piles of evidence that would go on to earn him the nickname he's still referred to by today. What law enforcement uncovered in Nico's apartment was beyond their wildest nightmares. Stolen human bones, human ashes, and sex tapes of hardcore BDSM were just the beginning. Inside the fridge, the stunned officers found several bags of human blood, the same blood Nico had stolen from the hospital. It was a sickening sight for the officers, but what was even more sickening was Nico's nonchalant confession. He told officers that he had the blood because he enjoyed drinking it, and willingly admitted that he'd been robbing graves in Paris for quite some time. Naturally, this led to a lengthy psychological investigation to ensure that he was fit to stand trial for the murder of Thierry Bissonnier. According to Nico, it was determined that he had a borderline psychotic personality disorder, necrophilia, and sexual sadism, and ultimately he was found guilty of premeditated murder, attempt to defraud, falsification of official documents, as well as armed robbery. However, the most twisted and not to mention concerning part of all this is that Claux was never convicted for any crimes relating to his grave robberies or cannibalism. And despite committing these crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to just 12 years in prison on May 9th of 1997.
Favorite graveyards.
The man who ate flesh from dead bodies, drank the blood of hospital patients, and murdered a man in cold blood still walks among us as a free man. During his time in prison, he routinely wrote to serial killers, a number of whom allegedly wrote back to him on a regular basis. When he was finally released just 8 years into his 12-year sentence, he was recognized and even celebrated by people with darker interests. Eventually, he would go on to claim that he feared that his ego was growing too much from the fame that came with his crimes.
I had to keep a low profile for this. So this is why I refused to do interviews for a period of 10 years. People thought that I was dead, actually, because I wasn't going to clubs anymore. I wasn't, And then after 10 years of working in different hospitals in Paris, even Catholic institutes and different morgues, I started to get recognized again. And it kind of spread like wildfire in the deaf worker industry. So, people ended up knowing, and I was fired off from 2 different places.
Since being fired from the morgues, Nico has chosen not to hide his identity. He runs an online store and a YouTube channel where he dives into the darker side of humanity. His store, which sells paintings of serial killers, items from crime scenes, and also models of serial killers, continues till this day to serve as a particularly dark look into his psyche. And then there are the sex toys themed after serial killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, who, it should be noted, were both convicted rapists.
I want to create a line of dildos based on serial killers. And it was like, this is the craziest and sickest idea I've ever heard, and it's brilliant.
The narrative of true crime is not owned by journalists anymore and TV people. The narrative is owned by the ones who commit the crimes. So that's a totally different perspective. And this is why I love books written by serial killers.
For many people, Nico's actions after his release from prison are red flags, and questions such as should he be able to flourish off the fame that he's gotten from the horrible crimes that he's committed, and also should he be able to sell a cookbook for cannibals and books about his twisted experiences, all for his own gain. Nico doesn't seem entirely concerned with his legacy or even the morality of what he's selling. Instead, he seems to relish in the position he's found himself in.
What's the first thing you'll do when you arrive in hell?
I will greet all the guys, checkmate, tac tac, look for my throne, sit on it, and yeah.
Let the fun begin.
If you found this episode interesting, then our previous one about yet another devil-worshipping killer is likely to do the same. You can click here to watch that video.